Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Mainstream Americans, as well as the nation's subcultures, embraced new forms of entertainment in the 1950s. Television and rock and roll became integral parts of the nation's culture and remain so today. And they emerged here in this post-war era. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to describe the suburban lifestyle of the 1950s. You should be able to explain the increase in consumerism in the 1950s. You should be able to explain how mass media in the 1950s reflected middle-class values. And you should be able to explain how rock and roll music clashed with middle-class values. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 14. Here, we're going to talk about the suburban lifestyle, or really the development of the suburbs at all. Most Americans worked in cities, but fewer and fewer of them lived there. New highways made the availability and affordability of automobiles, and gasoline being cheaper than ever made commuting possible. And by the early 1960s, every large city in the United States was surrounded by suburbs. Of the 13 million homes built in the 1950s, around 85% of them were all built in the suburbs. For many, the burbs embodied the American dream of affordable single-family homes and good schools and a safe, healthy environment for children and neighbors who looked just like themselves. Subpoint B. As soldiers returned from World War II and settled into family life, they contributed to an unprecedented population explosion known as the baby boom. Boom! During the late 1940s to the early 1960s, the birth rate, which is the number of live births per 1,000 people, that's known as the birth rate, it's a statistical measure, in the United States, it totally soared. At the height of the baby boom in 1957, one American infant was born in every 10 seconds. One American infant born every 10 seconds. A total of 4.3 million that year. The result was the largest generation in the nation's history. And contributing to the size of the baby boom generations were a lot of factors, including the reunion of husbands and wives after the war, the decreasing marriage age, the people were starting their families early, the desirability of large families, the confidence in continued economic prosperity, and advances in medicine. Subpoint C. Let's talk about a couple of those advances in medicine. Among the medical advantages that saved hundreds of thousands of children's lives was the discovery of drugs to fight and prevent childhood diseases like typhoid fever. Another breakthrough came when Dr. Jonas Salk developed a vaccine for polio. A lot of parents raised their children according to guidelines that were devised by the author and pediatrician, a guy named Dr. Benjamin Spock. In his 1946 book, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, was a huge bestseller. It sold nearly 10 million copies in that decade alone. In it, he advised parents not to spank or scold their children. He encouraged families to hold meetings in which children could express themselves. And Dr. Spock's book has never gone out of print. It's been updated a couple of times, but you can still buy today the Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. During this decade of the 1950s, 10 million students entered elementary schools. The sharp increase in enrollment caused overcrowding and teacher shortages in a lot of parts of the country. In California, a new school was opening every 7 days. Subpoint D. During the 1950s, the role of the homemaker and the mother was glorified in popular magazines and movies and TV programs such as Father Knows Best or The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Time magazine described the homemaker wife as the key figure in suburbia, the thread that weaves between family and community, the keeper of the suburban dream. In contrast to the ideal portrayed in media, however, some women were not happy with their roles. They felt isolated and bored and unfulfilled. According to one survey in the 1950s, more than 1/5 of suburban wives were actually pretty dissatisfied with their lives. It looked like an ideal life to live, but just really wasn't for them. The number of women working outside the home rose steadily during the decade. By 1960, around 40% of mothers with children between ages of 6 and 17 held paying jobs. The job didn't necessarily contribute to a woman's happiness either, though. A woman's career opportunities tend to be limited in fields such as nursing and teaching and office support. They paid less than other professional and business positions, and women often almost always earned less than men did for comparable work. Although increasing numbers of women were attending four-year colleges, they generally received little encouragement to go pursue their goals. Subpoint E. Most Americans of the 1950s had more leisure time than they had ever had before. Employees were pretty regularly working a 40-hour week and earned several weeks of vacation a year. People owned labor-saving devices like washing machines and clothes dryers and dishwashers and power lawnmowers and All those things allowed for more time for leisure activities. Fortune magazine reported that in 1953, Americans spent more than $30 billion on leisure goods and activities. Americans also became avid readers. That's crazy that people would read things intentionally. But book sales doubled, due in part to a thriving paperback market. Americans devoured books about cooking and religion and do-it-yourself projects and homemaking. They also read mysteries and romance novels and fiction by popular writers. The circulation of popular magazines like Reader's Digest and Sports Illustrated steadily rose from around 148 million to more than 190 million readers. Sales of comic books also reached their peak in the mid-1950s. So, Roman numeral number 15. Here we need to talk about a consumer culture, because the 50s are totally driven by consumerism, and I don't think there's a better understanding of it than the automania that gripped America. During World War II, the United States government had rationed gasoline to go curb inflation and to conserve supplies. After the war, though, an abundance of both imported and domestically made petroleum, raw material from which gasoline is made, led to inexpensive, plentiful fuel for consumers. Easy credit and extensive advertising persuaded Americans to buy cars in record numbers. In response, new car sales rose from 6.7 million in 1950 to 7.9 million in 1955. The total numbers of private cars on the road jumped from 40 million cars in 1950 to 60 million by the end of the decade. Suburbs made car owning a necessity. I mean, if you're going to live far from your work, you got to have a way to get there. Most new suburbs were built in formerly rural areas. They didn't have public transportation, and so people had to drive to their jobs in the cities. In addition, many of the schools and stores and churches and doctors' offices, they weren't within the walking distance of suburban homes. Subpoint B. That was all made possible, though, by the brand new invention of the interstate highway system, because the more cars there were, the more roads that were needed. Automania had spurred local and state governments to construct roads linking the major cities while connecting schools and shopping centers and workplaces and residential suburbs. Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act in 1956, authorizing the government to build a national highway network, 41,000 miles of expressways. The new roads encouraged the development of suburbs even farther from the cities. The interstate highways made high-speed, long-haul traffic possible, and that contributed to a decline in the commercial use of railroads. Towns along the new highways prospered, while towns along the older, smaller railroads experienced hard times. If you've seen the movie Cars and you know how much Radiator Springs suffered when the interstate went through, that's a real story. I mean, not Radiator Springs, it's a Pixar show, but like otherwise, the story that they're talking about, that's totally a real story. The highway system also helped to unify and homogenize the nation. With access to cars and affordable gas and new highways, and more Americans hit the road. They flocked to the mountains, the lakes, and the national parks, and historic sites, and amusement parks for family vacations. Disneyland opened in California in 1955, and that year attracted 3 million visitors. Subpoint C. By the mid-1950s, nearly 60% of Americans were members of the middle class, about twice as many as before World War II, and one new product after another appeared in the marketplace as various industries responded to this new consumer demand. Newsweek magazine reported in 1956 that hundreds of brand new goods have become commonplace just right overnight. Consumers purchased electric household appliances as washing machines and dryers and blenders and freezers and dishwashers in record numbers. With more and more leisure time to fill, people invested in recreational items. They bought televisions and tape recorders and new hi-fi record players. They bought casual clothing to suit their suburban lifestyles, and powered lawnmowers and barbecue grills and swimming pools and lawn decorations for their suburban homes. Lawn decorations. Subpoint D. In addition to creating new products, manufacturers also began to use a marketing strategy called planned obsolescence in order to encourage consumers to purchase more goods. Manufacturers would purposely design products to become obsolete, that is to like wear out or become outdated in a really short period of time. Car makers leaned into this, producing new models every year, encouraging people to stay up to date. And because of planned obsolescence, Americans came to expect new and better products like every year. You should have new stuff. They began to discard items that were sometimes just barely new, because they're barely used, because they could get new and improved. Some consumers thought that American culture was on its way to becoming maybe its own throwaway society. Subpoint E. The advertising industry capitalized on this runaway consumerism by encouraging even more and more spending. Ads were everywhere, in newspapers and magazines, on radio and television, on billboards along the highways, promoting people to buy goods that ranged from cars to cereals to cigarettes. Since Americans had basically satisfied their basic needs, advertisers tried to convince them to buy new things they didn't really need. More and more ad executives and designers turned to psychology to create new best strategies for selling. Advertisers appealed to people's desire for status and belongingness. They strived to associate their products with these kinds of values. Television was the greatest advertising tool ever, becoming not only a medium for the mass transmission of cultural values, but a symbol of popular culture itself. Roman numeral number 16. Let's talk about this new era of mass media and the rise of television, because compared with other mass media is the means of communication to reach large audiences. Television developed with a lightning speed. It was first widely available in 1948, and TV had reached 9% of American homes by 1950. By 1954, 55% of American homes. By 1960, almost 90%. But at the beginning of the decade, around 10% of Americans had a television. By the end of the decade, 90% of Americans had a television. Around 45 million of American homes had TV sets. Early television sets were small boxes with round screens. Programming was meager. I mean, there's 3 networks max if your town had all 3 of them. Broadcasts were in black and white. And the first regular broadcast began in 1949, and they reached only a small part of the East Coast. They offered maybe 2 hours of programming a week. Post-World War II innovations, though, like the microwave relays, they could transmit television waves over long distance. That brought the television boom. The technology was going to create the demand. By 1956, the Federal Communications Commission, which is the government agency that licenses TV and radio and broadcast industries. They'd allowed 500 new stations to broadcast. This period of rapid expansion was the golden age of television entertainment. Entertainment in the 50s often meant comedy. People like Milton Berle were attracting huge audiences with the Texaco Star Theater. And Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz's early sitcom, The I Love Lucy, became enormously popular in 1951. At the same time, the veteran radio broadcaster Edward R. Murrow introduced 2 TV shows and 2 TV innovations: the on-the-scene news reporting with his program See It Now, and the interview show in Person to Person. Western sporting events and original dramas were shown on Playhouse 90 and Studio One. They offered entertainment variety. Children's programs such as the Mickey Mouse Club and the Howdy Doody Show were attracting young fans. American businesses took advantage of the opportunities offered by the television industry, and they would advertise to go support these TV programs. Advertising expenditures were $170 million in 1950. They were nearly $2 billion with a B by the end of the decade. Sales of TV Guide, a magazine that was about what's on television, was introduced in 1953, and they quickly outpaced sales of all the other not all the other magazines, but they quickly outpaced magazines. In 1954, the food industry included a new convenience item: welcome to the frozen TV dinner. Complete, ready-made, individual meals on disposable aluminum trays. TV dinners made it easy for people to eat without missing their favorite shows. The food is already cooked. You just heat it up in the oven. You just eat it out of the aluminum tray sitting in front of the television. What a dream. Subpoint B. Although TV turned out to be wildly popular, radio and movies also survived. Instead of competing with television's mass market for drama and variety shows, radio pivoted, and they turned to local programming of news and weather and music and community issues. And the strategy paid off. During the decade, radio advertising rose by 35%, and the number of radio stations increased by 50%. From the beginning, though, television cut into the profitable movie market. In 1948, 18,500 movie theaters were drawing nearly 90 million paid admissions a week, but as more people stayed home to watch television, the number of moviegoers decreased by essentially half. But the film industry capitalized on advantages that movies had over television: the size of the screen and the color that would be offered over black and white televisions, and the stereophonic sound, that there could be good sound quality there. Stereophonic sound surrounded the viewer. It was introduced in 1952, and those were serious advantages over 50s television. By 1954, more than half of movies were in color. By contrast, color television would become available in 1954, but didn't become widespread until the 60s. Other innovations were also big out to keep the movie industry afloat. In 1953, the 20th Century Fox introduced CinemaScope, which projected a widescreen angle on a broad screen. The industry also tried novelty features like Smell-O-Vision and the Aroma-Rama, piped in smells into movie theaters to coincide with events shown on the screen. Three-dimensional images, like a 3D movie, were viewed through special glasses supplied by the theaters. It's like the screen leapt onto the audience. Subpoint C. I want to take a second and talk about the counterculture as well. While we've been talking about mainstream culture, there's also a counterculture, which is decidedly not mainstream culture, and I don't think there's a better example in the 1950s of our Subpoint C, the Beats. Although mass media found a white audience, I guess probably a white audience too, although mass media found a white audience for their portrayals of mostly white popular culture, dissenting voices rang throughout the 1950s. The messages of the beat movement in literature and rock and roll, it clashed with the tidy suburban life and set the stage for the counterculture that would really bust forth in the late 1960s. The Beats were centered in San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York's Greenwich Village, and this movement expressed social and literary nonconformity, the nonconformity of artists and poets and writers. The word beat originally meant weary, like, man, I'm beat, but it came to mean a musical beat as well. Author Jack Kerouac, perhaps the greatest figure of the Beat generation, also described the Beat generation in terms of the beatific vision, noting that the Beat generation were searching for authentic beauty. Followers of this movement were called Beats or Beatniks. They lived nonconformist lives. They tended to shun regular work and sought higher consciousness through things like Zen Buddhism and music and drugs. Many Beat poets and writers believed in imposing as little structure as possible on their artistic works. Their artistic works often had a free, open form. They read their poetry aloud in coffee houses and gathering places. Take, for instance, the poet Allen Ginsberg. His signature poem, Howl, published in 1956, rolled in long, jazz-style rhythms describing the struggles of young artists who rejected the dominant culture. Its opening line is still one of the greatest opening lines of poetry in American literature. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. But the single greatest literary work of the Beat movement was Jack Kerouac's 1956 novel, On the Road, which described a nomadic search across America for authentic experiences of people and values. His famous line, "The only people for me are the mad ones, those who are mad to live and mad to talk and mad to be saved, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like a fabulous yellow Roman candle exploding like spiders across the stars." Jack Kerouac's novel, On the Road, is brilliant. You absolutely should not read it as a Catholic high school student, but when you get older, oh man, wait till you're about 25. On the Road, Jack Kerouac. Don't read it now. Wait for it. Trust me on this one. Many mainstream Americans found this lifestyle of the Beat generation a little odd and certainly less than enchanting. Roman numeral number 17. Hey, I want to talk about maybe one of the great sounds of the 1950s, and that's the development of rock and roll, Subpoint A. While the Beats were expressing themselves in unstructured literature, musicians in the 1950s added electronic instruments to traditional blues music, creating a new genre known as rhythm and blues. R&B was predominantly played by black musicians. In 1951, in Cleveland, Ohio, radio disc jockey, a guy named Alan Freed, was among the first to go play this new R&B music. His listeners, most of them white, responded enthusiastically, and Freed began promoting this new sound, music that grew out of the fusion of rhythm and blues and country and pop. He called this new music rock and roll, a name that has come to mean music that's both black and white. It's maybe America's greatest art form. Subpoint B. So let's talk about this new sound of rock and roll. In the early and mid-1950s, Richard Penniman, Chuck Berry, Bill Haley and his Comets, and especially Elvis Presley brought rock and roll to a frantic pitch of popularity among the newly affluent teens who bought their records. The music, music's heavy rhythm and simple melodies and lyrics, featuring love and cars and the problems of being young, it captivated teenagers across the country. Elvis Presley, the unofficial but totally official king of rock and roll, first developed his musical style by singing in church and listening to gospel and country and blues music on the radio in Memphis, Tennessee. When he was a young boy, his mother gave him a guitar, and years later he paid the $4 of his own money to record 2 songs in 1953. Sam Phillips was a rhythm and blues producer. He discovered Presley and produced his first records. In 1955, Phillips sold Presley's contract to RCA for $35,000, a pretty handsome sum in '55. Presley's live appearances were immediately popular, and 45 of his records sold over 1 million copies, including some of the ones that are still kind of the sound of the era: Heartbreak Hotel and Hound Dog and All Shook Up and Don't Be Cruel and Burning Love. Although Look magazine dismissed him as a wild troubadour who wails in rock and roll tunes, flails erratically at his guitar, and wriggles like a peep show dancer, Presley's rebellious style captivated young audiences. Girls screamed and fainted when he performed, and boys tried to imitate him. A lot of adults condemned rock and roll They believed the new music would lead to teenage delinquency and immorality. In a few cities, rock and roll concerts were outright banned. Despite the controversy, though, TV and radio exposure brought rock and roll into the mainstream, and it became more acceptable by the end of the decade. Record sales, which were 189 million in 1950, grew with the popularity of rock and roll, reaching 600 million records sold by 1950. Subpoint C. African American music had inspired rock and roll, and many of the genre's greatest performers were, like Chuck Berry and Penniman, were African Americans. In other genres, performers like Nat King Cole and Lena Horne and singer and actor Harry Belafonte and many others paved the way for minority representation in the entertainment fields. Musicians like Miles Davis, man, Miles Davis is so good. Musicians like Miles Davis and Sonny Rollins and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and, oh man, Dizzy Gillespie is so good. And Thelonious Monk. That's kind of a good list. They played a style of music characterized by the use of improvisation called jazz. These guys became transitional artists in the genre of jazz and entertained audiences of all races. They basically take what had been like Louis Armstrong's jazz and like the sounds of the 30s, kind of 40s, the swing era. And man, by the 1950s, this jazz totally changes, and it's these black artists that make it possible. By the 1950s, African-American shows were broadcast on separate stations from white shows. By 1954, there were 250 stations nationwide on the radio, aiming specifically at African-American listeners. African-American stations were part of radio's attempt to go counter the mass popularity of television by targeting specific audiences. The stations were also serving advertisers who wanted to reach African-American audiences on their own, but it was black listeners who had fewer television sets than whites did. They didn't find themselves reflected in the mainstream programming of television. They appreciated this targeted sound to them the most. The cultural transition that comes in the 1950s, the opportunity for leisure, the expanding workforce, the changes of television, of the suburbs, of the way people live and travel and move and talk to each other and relate to each other and broadcast to each other and hear each other is going to break out in 100 different ways, and it's a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.